Lately, I've been getting loads of questions about semi-hydro, this lovely substrate right here. And because I've been using this substrate for like the past nearly 5 years, it'd be a good time to answer some questions about it, chat about like the sort of whole process of everything, and really get into sort of a semi-hydro deep dive video today and like share all of my experiences, all of my opinions, what I've seen works really well, what isn't as good, how I move things over to semi-hydro, repotting, watering, all of the things. And I should say also this video is going to be probably quite long because there's going to be a whole heck of a lot of information in it. But I have chaptered it, so if there is a specific bit of information you are looking for, head to the like sort of chapters in the progress bar and find the one that is right for you. This could also be a good like video for you to save and reference back to if you're working on semi-hydro things in the future and you need like a question answered quickly. This video is going to be for that. But if you're just here to like learn and chat and repot some semi-hydro plants with me, that is also fine as well. But before we get into it, I want to say if you're new here and you don't know me already, hi, my name is Emma and I make houseplanty content all over the internet. So if you want to follow along with my houseplanty journey and maybe learn something along the way, stick around, watch some more of my videos and subscribe to my channel. If you are not new here, welcome back. I really appreciate you returning. I should also say, if anyone wants to be notified when I do post videos, you can click the little bell icon next to the subscribe button and you can be notified by YouTube when I post new things and like just know immediately, as opposed to like having to log on and find it. You can know immediately, like straight to your phone. So that's an option if anyone wants it, but like absolutely no pressure if that's not your thing. But without any further ado, let us get into this. I'm a little bit nervous. I have like a lot of information and I have written it down on my phone here just because I wanted to make sure that I said everything that I could possibly talk about in this video because there is a lot. So I'm going to start off by transferring my Alocasia Jacqueline or Tunderosa here, which is already in semi-hydro substrate, but is a little bit, it's getting big for its pot. You can see that the roots have started to grow out of the pot, so I figured it's probably time for something a little bit bigger. And I have a pot probably, I mean, it's probably more than one size up, but I feel like in the world of self-watering pots, the options are somewhat limited. So this is one size up for me in semi-hydro. So that's where we're gonna start. I've also got some other things that I'm gonna probably do a bit of a chain, maybe pot something into this pot and one further. Oh, I've also got, where did I put it? Did I pull it out? I've got an Alocasia that I want to pot up from like propagation and something as well that I want to put into semi-hydro from soil, so I can kind of show you that process as well. So I think a good place to start would be a very quick rundown of what semi-hydro is. Basically, it is an inorganic substrate made of a bunch of different types of rocks like zeolite, lava rock, pumice, leca. It depends on who you're getting it from, what exactly is in it, but it's mostly like quite porous rocks and no organic matter whatsoever in it. And it kind of acts as a wicking system around your plant's roots and holds a little bit of water, and so the roots can access that whenever it wants. And it creates like a nice balance of water and air, which is really nice for your houseplants. And I have found that a lot of plants really do like it. There is some that I find work better than others. For me, at least, as someone who is more of a chronic underwaterer in soil, I find that plants like Alocasias here, or begonias, or peace lilies, marantas, things that typically need a little bit more moisture in their soil, or like things that want to stay a bit more moist, are going to do better in semi-hydro. At least in my experience, they'll do better in semi-hydro for me than they do in soil because they have typically access to a reservoir of water at the bottom of the pot. And so instead of me having to worry about exactly when I need to water them, I can just make sure that the water reservoir never dries out fully, and so that they'll always have access to it and they won't faint or go thirsty like they can and typically do for me in soil because I am such an underwaterer. But those aren't the only plants that I think do well in semi-hydro. I have philodendrons in semi-hydro, monsteras, anthuriums really like it as well, especially when they're putting out new leaves, because I find that when anthuriums are putting out new leaves, they just want a constant supply of water because they're using a lot of energy to like sort of make a new leaf happen. So they're needing a lot, and if they get too dry during that process, it can cause the leaves to rip or not grow in as well, kind of stunt their growth a little bit. So anthuriums do make a really good candidate in my experience for semi-hydro. But you could probably put almost anything in semi-hydro as long as you are careful enough. I know loads of people really rate Hoyas in semi-hydro. Personally, that's not my cup of tea. I really like keeping my Hoyas in soil, but I have heard great things from other people about it, so it's not something I would totally rule out. I do have one Hoya in semi-hydro and it's perfectly happy, so I can't say they're bad. It just isn't my go-to for them, if that makes sense. But basically, there's some plants that I will, without fail, put into semi-hydro. And for me, I mean, if this can come out, for me, one of the main ones is alocasias. I find that they do extremely, extremely well in semi-hydro. They're very, very happy in here. They're getting enough water to sort of grow well. It's actually helped my alocasias stop cycling quite a bit, which is a big problem I've had with a lot of alocasias. It allows them to actually like keep leaves as opposed to getting rid of them as frequently. In my experience, at least. Obviously, this is just coming from my years of trial and error with a lot of things. And so it's not a foolproof method, but I have found that almost all of my alocasias really love it. My begonias, I pretty much exclusively grow in semi-hydro. If I had things like marantas, I would put them in there. I've grown things like Syndapsis. I have my big Syndapsis exotica in semi-hydro, but for the most part, I tend to not grow things like Syndapsis or like pothos, like sort of hanging philodendrons. I tend not to put those in semi-hydro because it's not the best thing for hanging plants in my experience, because it is heavier than soil. It's rocks after all. There's like not much lightness to it. And while they are porous, they do still hold weight. And especially if you've got a water reservoir, this pot, it's going to be much heavier if it's got semi-hydro and a water reservoir than it would if it just had soil in it. And so those are harder things to hang and will put more stress on whatever you're hanging them, whether it be a wall hook or, I don't know, like I just feel like it's more likely to fall. But also, you can't really compact the substrate down. It doesn't compact like soil does. And so if you've got tendrils that are hanging down that are quite heavy, if they get too heavy for their sort of root system, they can pull themselves out of the semi-hydro because you can't like pack it in the same way. You shouldn't be pushing down the semi-hydro to like get around the roots like you might do with soil, because they're rocks. They're slightly sharper, more abrasive, and can cause damage to the roots if you aren't sort of gentle with it. And so I tend to not go for hanging stuff with semi-hydro just because it's not as easy of a substrate. I just don't find it as like intuitive as I do sort of vertical standing up things. I also find that it's really good for propagation, especially propagating things like alocasia corms, because I'm going to be eventually putting them into semi-hydro. Having them in a sort of slightly wetter version of semi-hydro while propagating has worked really, really well for me. It's one of the few methods that I find has the highest like success rate in my experience, so highly recommend Semi-Hydro for propping alocasia corms. I also use Semi-Hydro substrate, just the substrate with no water reservoir for my cacti and succulents, basically it existing as an inorganic substrate, kind of similar to what they would be growing in like a sort of desert. You know how like you see a succulent in a desert, it's got like a very sandy soil around it. There's not as much like organic matter in there. It's more rocks and sand and gravel. That is mimicked by the Semi-Hydro without a water reservoir, so not pot in something like a self-watering pot. I use that substrate for them, and they seem to really like it in there and have done well. I think I have a video on that as well, so I will link it down below in the description if you want to know more on that. But for the most part today, I'm going to be talking about Semi-Hydro substrate in self-watering pots, because that is like the primary use, I believe, for it. I should have said earlier, Semi-Hydro, the substrate stands for Semi-Hydroponics. So it is a water-based growing where there's hydroponics, but it's only semi because there is still a substrate there. And it's the same stuff as Pon, Lechuza Pon, that's just a brand name, kind of how you'd call a tissue Kleenex. It's just kind of become associated, but I try and use the term Semi-Hydro for it, and that also happens to be what the stuff I get is called from Soil Ninja. Speaking of the stuff I get both the fine and the coarse Semi-Hydro from Soil Ninja. I like both of them. You can also get Pon from Lechuza, and that stuff is closer to the sort of fine Semi-Hydro, but do beware, that stuff has slow release fertilizer in it already, so you won't need to fertilize for a little while. I can get more into fertilization a little bit later, but that stuff is really good. I've liked using it. So that's available, I think, potentially worldwide, but it might be more expensive in places outside of Europe, because I think it's a German company originally. Soil Ninja stuff is available in Europe and EU. Sorry, Americas. I also personally haven't tried anything that's other than Lechuza that's available in the US, but I have heard good things about the Crystal Star. I think it's called Magical Mineral Mix or something. I've, like I said, not used it myself, so I cannot comment on whether or not it's good, but I think they're Canadian. And so if you're looking for an alternative in the Americas, that might be an option. I don't know if they ship to the US or what, but if any of you US people have any suggestions for places you can get Semi-Hydro substrate in the US, pop them down below in the comments, because like I said, I can't comment on it because I'm not there. I don't know what the options are, and I don't know which of them are good or not. So check the comments, and if I can, I'll like pin one or something if there is a good option that I think looks about right for the US. But you can also DIY it. I've heard of a lot of people doing that online. I personally haven't done that because I do have access to such great stuff, but it's usually a mixture of lava rock, zeolite, pumice. Sometimes there's leca in it, or clay pieces, stuff like that. It really depends on where you're getting it from, what the exact mix is, but it's usually a combination of that. And you can buy all of those things in big bags and mix your own. If you've got a storage, that'd be great. I personally don't, so I don't plan on making my own anytime soon. So I have finished doing the Jacqueline now. Repotting in Semi-Hydro is so easy. I find it's a lot easier than soil. It's a lot less messy. My hands are clean. There's not really a mess everywhere. So I do really like that, and I can get more into repotting in a little bit, but I really love, I love this substrate. I don't know if you can tell based off of my sort of reactions to things, but I genuinely love this substrate so freaking much. Oh, I can also talk about size in this bit, because from Soil Ninja at least, and I'm probably, if you're making your own DIY mix, you'll have to like sort of specify the size that you want. It can matter, but it also doesn't have to. I think the general rule is that things with finer roots, so things like smaller alocasias and marantas, begonias, things with fine roots will do better in fine semi-hydro, the smaller rocks, and things with chunkier roots like anthuriums will do better in the chunky semi-hydro. And I do somewhat follow that, but another great thing about semi-hydro is it can be recycled and you can use it over and over and over again. You saw that I just poured my semi-hydro into this bowl, and I will go through and I will boil a bunch up, depending how much I do, maybe later today. Once I've boiled that up, I've basically cleansed it, sanitized it, make sure it's like all clean, and if there was anything in there, any sort of pest, any sort of rot or whatever, boiling it would sort that situation out. And so because I recycle all of mine, it ends up being like quite a mix of different sizes. You can see there's like some quite big pieces in there, but it's also got quite a lot of fine pieces, and it ends up just being one big mix, which I kind of like better. I quite like that it's a good mix, and whenever I end up using just fine or just coarse, because like I've got a new bag or something, it feels really weird. I really much prefer it being a sort of mixture of sizes, and so I do end up I end up mixing my bags up quite a lot in order to get a sort of consistency that is like my preference. Also, having bigger pieces is really good for covering the sort of holes in the bottom of the self-watering pots. You can see they're not tiny usually, and so a lot of the fine semi-hydro pieces can usually fit through those holes, and so even just putting a layer of straight leca or the coarse semi-hydro at the bottom can help like not let the substrate go through as easily. Next up in this little repot train, I want to take my Alocasia bisma. You can tell I really like this for alocasias. I want to take my Alocasia bisma and pot it up into, I mean, it's not that much bigger, but I think it is ever so slightly bigger. And I think this one would benefit from just a bit of something, because it does quite have, like you can see the roots are starting to grow up above the semi-hydro. So I think it would benefit from something slightly larger. If I can get it out. There are loads of different types of things you can use as pots. You technically don't need anything different. You don't need to go out and get yourself self-watering pots. That is not necessary. Oh, there's some beautiful corms in here. That isn't necessary to convert things to semi-hydro. You can use a normal nursery pot in a cache pot and just make sure you keep a sort of water reservoir at the bottom of it. I personally have done that many, many times before. It's just not my favorite way of doing things because it's harder to see the sort of water level and harder to make sure that it's getting watered properly and it's not drying out. I find that when I used to do that more often, I would experience my plants drying out and I'm not noticing it until they had dried out to a point where they were unhappy, and then that caused root rot. One of the main issues in semi-hydro is root rot and trying to avoid it, and using pots like that encouraged root rot in my experience, and I didn't like that, and so they're not my favorite. I do have a preference towards self-watering pots. I have a few favorites, and I've done, I think, a whole self-watering pot review video, which again, I will link down below, and I'll have links to all of my favorite ones. This is one of my favorites, even though I don't think they sell them on Amazon anymore. That's fine. You can get pots from Lechuza specifically, but they do tend to be more expensive. They are some of the highest quality ones though, and I do think, not that they're not worth the money, because I think they are worth what they're giving you, but you can find cheaper options, and while they might be slightly worse quality plastic, I've not had any issues with worse pots, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But these are fantastic. You can get packs of like 10 plastic pots similar to this one, but smaller on Amazon. These ones specifically are ones that I really like that I didn't show in the other video. I got these from Eastern Tropicals, and I really like that they have a clear insert. The other ones, the smaller ones I have of these, they have a white insert, so you can't see as well what is going on in the substrate, whereas I feel like it's really beneficial to be able to see what's going on. You can monitor the roots better, check for rot better, see whether or not they need to repot better. It's just generally better. So having something with a clear insert is great. I'm also a massive fan of the Elho inserts because I have a lot of Elho pots, and you can just get the insert and use the pots you already have. But the problem with those is the smallest one I think is 17 centimeters. And that is quite large for a lot of plants, especially if you're starting them from smaller things or growing allocations from corms. You're not going to put it straight into a 17 centimeter pot. That just doesn't make any sense. But I do really love the Elho ones. They're really good quality for not very much money, and I think they are one of the best bets. I also highly recommend something with an indicator. I know lots of them don't have indicators, but having some sort of indication to see the water level is massively important. And I think that was one of the problems I was running into with doing the sort of nursery pot, sort of like self-watering pot hack, was that there was no indicator for me to see the water level. And so you can just go buy a pack of indicators off of Amazon. I am tempted to do that because then you'll be able to see the water level without pulling the pot out. But you can also just get pots with the indicators because I find them really helpful to see the level. Or ones like this one are transparent. This one isn't the easiest to see through because it's a dark plastic, but I can see the water level from afar. Or these ones, they have a little window in there where you can see the water level and use that to figure out when to water. But there's loads of different options. I think there's many really great options out there online. There could always be more. It is like, I suppose if you are buying specific pots, it will be slightly more expensive than soil up front because in theory you don't need anything for the ones in, oh my goodness, sorry. Brain. I did that. I put a little bit too much semi-hydro to start. I do like putting some just to cover up the holes, and then put this in so I can pot it ever so slightly deeper than it was before. Get those top roots covered because that will be better for it. You can also do no drainage with semi-hydro, which I have become quite a fan of. Last year I did my first no drainage repot with semi-hydro, and since then I have found that my plants really like it. And I think the main thing when repotting in no drainage is making sure you do it at the right level. I will show an example of that in a little bit when I do my ficus, because I'm going to be popping it into this glass jar. You can do it with glass jars, glass vases. I've got some plastic rubbish bins that I have repurposed into semi-hydro vessels. Basically anything that's somewhat transparent will work because you do want to be able to see the water level. It can be somewhat difficult, especially if you're getting things like darker plastic or glass or even solid color. You can do that if you put an indicator in. This is where like buying a pack of indicators can come in handy. And I find it is quite useful in no drainage to have the indicator in because then you can see it a little bit better. You can kind of see the level at a quick glance as opposed to actually having to look closely at where the water line is, because it can get quite difficult sometimes to tell where that water line is and to know when you need to water. So I do prefer to have something that's like very clear, this needs water. By having an indicator, I find that can be extremely helpful, but again, not necessary, and it's just ever so slightly more thinking, more work if you're going to not include an indicator in there. But totally fine. I have plenty of things in no drainage semi-hydro that work perfectly well. And also, I'm not exactly sure why, but somehow, like, you know how I said the like roots sitting in the water in the sort of nursery pot, fake self-watering pot method was a problem? Somehow in no drainage, it's like somehow mitigated and totally fine. I think it is to do with the depth at which you plant it. When you're originally putting it into the semi-hydro, you don't want the water level to go up to the roots. I know that sounds complicated. I feel like there's just so much technicality to semi-hydro, and it makes like a massive difference. So like it is all possible, I promise. Also, you can totally put plants with moss poles into semi-hydro. The main thing is that you're making sure that the moss doesn't go below the sort of level of the semi-hydro. So I do it similarly in soil, where in the moss pole, the moss only goes down to the surface of the soil. You don't want the moss to be going underneath the semi-hydro, because then that's organic matter in there that can like probably cause more chance of rot. So as long as it's just sitting just above or just on top of the semi-hydro level, it's absolutely fine. I have my Tycon in that. My Varicosum has a moss pole in semi-hydro and is absolutely fine with it, and I've not experienced any issues there. Next up in my lovely little chain, we're gonna keep going. I have these lovely little Alocasia mellow corms that have sprouted that I am just going to pot into. This might be a little bit big. Okay, grabbed a probably slightly smaller pot for those little mellows. And I do quickly want to mention as well, a lot of self-watering pots will come with wicks. These ones that I got like a pack of 10 on Amazon came with these cotton wicks. And these wicks, I have found, they do go moldy. They are an organic fiber, and so they can get moldy, which is unfortunate. You don't want that, and it can like lead towards rot in your plants. You can get like acrylic ones and stuff, but I bought myself a pack of microfiber towels and cut them into strips, and I use that in all of these sort of self-watering pots that use a wicking system to use instead of these strings that they come with, just because I find I haven't had any issues with them rotting or anything like I have with the cotton ones. Not all self-watering pots do use a wicking system though. Some go all the way down to the bottom, like this one. And so it doesn't need a wick. And so you kind of just do whatever the self-watering pot dictates. If you're doing a sort of DIY one, you can DIY a pot with a wick. If you have something smaller, like a smaller cup that goes inside a bigger cup that you can see doesn't go down all the way to the bottom of the bigger cup, you'll need a wick in order for the water in the water reservoir to be pulled up into the semi-hydro substrate. So I hope that makes sense. The next important thing I want to talk about is watering. Watering is very different in semi-hydro because there's almost always some sort of water reservoir with the self-watering pot that you've got going. And so instead of waiting to see the semi-hydro drying out, you basically want to be making sure that the water reservoirs never go completely dry. I never, ever, ever let my water reservoirs go dry, because that is when you can start to encounter issues with rot as well, like dry rot that then becomes wet root rot, which you don't want. Because the roots that are growing in the semi-hydro, they're closer to water roots than they are soil roots, and so they do not want to dry out all the way. They do not. And letting them dry out all the way can cause issues. So I never, where possible, let my reservoirs completely empty out. I almost always have some little bit of water in there, and I water when I notice that the level is getting very low. Like if you let it sit dry for too long, it can cause issues. When things are in no drainage, I kind of use the top layer of semi-hydro. The top layer will dry out fully, and I use that as my sort of indicator sometimes, and that has worked really, really well for me. And another big question I have gotten is how far to fill up the water. I like to fill my reservoirs until they are full. It makes sense because then I'm not going to have to water them as frequently. And for ones that have this sort of window thing, I'll just fill it up to the top of that window. This one, I just make sure it doesn't get to the point where it is hitting the bottom of the insert. So it ends up being about there. For the ones with the indicator, I usually fill it up to the max level, and that has worked really, really well for me. In no drainage, it can be ever so slightly more difficult to tell when you need to water because there's not a sort of indicator. I like to water until the level's about a quarter of the way up the vessel. So when I pot into this one, my water level will probably be about there, a quarter or a third of the way up. And that tends to be quite good. And especially because when I am potting into this one, you'll see in a little bit, I will put the roots down to like maybe there. And so the roots will not sit in the water at the very beginning at least, which is quite important. Eventually, you can get to the point where the roots will grow down into that sort of reservoir in no drainage, and that's absolutely fine because if they are growing down to that point where they're growing into the water, they're water roots and they will be totally fine in that situation. So try and make sure you're not letting those roots sit in the water until it has grown its own roots, and those roots can go down into the water. I feel like this is just so complicated. I really hope this is making sense. So I've finished potting up my little mellow, and I will give all of these a thorough water before I put them back into their zones. Right, we can now get into my ficus soil to semi-hydro conversion. So going from soil, some plants are going to be easier than others. Plants that have sort of bigger, thicker roots are going to be easier to transfer because essentially when you swap from soil to semi-hydro, you want to get all of the soil, all of it, all of the organic matter off of the roots of the plant. You don't want there to be any left on. And so plants with thicker roots and nice chunky roots like anthuriums are going to be easier to swap over than things with very spindly, fine roots. Those are just harder to get the soil out from. It just is because they're smaller, and so you do need to be gentler and more delicate with it. Also because when you are unpotting it and taking all the soil off the roots like this, it can be quite rough on your plant, and so you just need to take your time and be patient. That's sort of my main tip when swapping over, when taking soil off the roots, because you don't want to harm the plant. Being really aggressive with the roots can lead to your plant being more likely to fail in the transformation from soil to semi-hydro. It can be not a great time for plants. I found things like begonias, which have very, very fine roots, really struggle with that transition. I've had a few that just didn't do very well and are still recovering, even like months and months down the line. I've heard of some people who've had their begonias like die back completely and lose all of their leaves when they have been transferred over to semi-hydro. So one of the main things is to just be really patient with it and take your time. It's not something that you want to rush because when you're rushing, you're going to be more careless and it'll be easier to damage the roots in the process. So you can see I'm just being very slow and gentle with it, not breaking the roots off, just trying to get all these little pieces of soil off as much as I can. For plants like begonias, I found it's actually easier, instead of going from soil into semi-hydro, to take cuttings of that plant, root them in water, and get them rooted with water roots, and then put those rooted cuttings into the semi-hydro. I found that's just a little bit easier for them, and I'm more likely to have success with them that way than with the stress of going straight from one to the other. So if you are worried about things, maybe I don't want to say don't, but like I wouldn't do my first soil to semi-hydro like conversion on a plant that I'm obsessed with, on a plant that I couldn't live without, that I can't replace, that has like special meaning or something. That is not the time to be trying out semi-hydro for the first time if you don't already. I would do it with something that you are one, already sort of familiar with, that you might have had for a while, or that you could like easily replace. So like try something out that like an alocasia poly, something that you could get in any sort of plant shop, something that would be really, really easy to get your hands on, and you wouldn't be upset if you did end up losing it, because there is always risk when you're doing things like this with your plants. They can always have a bad time. Not every plant is the same, and nothing is like 100%. There's no like absolute guarantee that it will be fine. There is always that little bit of risk in there. So it's when I get to about this point with my plant's roots where almost all of the soil is off, I will then go in and rinse these. I'm going to take this to the sink and rinse them off. If you have an outdoor area, it'd be better to do it outside. Ideally, don't rinse with water that's too cold or too hot, because that can shock the roots further. But my goal is to get all of the organic matter off of these roots as much as possible, to get them really nice and clean in order to go into the substrate. This here is what the roots are looking like post-rinse. Very, very clean. There probably is still a tiny bit of organic matter in there. It's quite difficult to get 100% of the organic matter off, but like just do your best, and do your best without like really tugging at the roots, because that can cause problems. You can see I have moved my pile of soil here, and I'm not going to set these down on top of that dirty surface, because that can cause issues. I'm just going to pop them into the semi-hydro box while I prep my vessel. So I am going to be using this glass vessel, like I said, and you don't want to put the plant at the bottom. Don't do that. I'm probably going to put up to there with semi-hydro before I even think about putting the plant in. You can also take things from propagation and put them into semi-hydro. It is totally doable. It is easiest if you're going from something like perlite propagation or water propagation, because the roots will be the same in those as they would in the semi-hydro substrate. So it's not like a sort of big drastic difference for them. And also from those substrates, you don't even have to rinse the roots, because there's sometimes perlite in semi-hydro mixes. It's an inorganic substrate, and so you don't really need to worry about it as much. And with water, there's nothing on them. So it should be fine. As long as your roots aren't moldy or rotten in water prop, then you'll be okay. But when you're transferring from something like sphagnum moss, which I have done, it can just be a little bit more of a pain, because you want to get as much of that sphagnum moss off as possible in order for the best chance of success. So again, with sphagnum, I would take as much off and then go and rinse them to get even more of the sphagnum off, and try and make it so there's ideally no sphagnum moss going into your semi-hydro pot. So half of the pot with semi-hydro. I could probably go a little bit less, but for demonstration's sake, I think more is, okay, no, I lied. I'm gonna do a little bit less. A third of the pot. I feel like that's probably a little bit more accurate to what would be ideal. And I am just going to take all of my different pieces and kind of Tetris them into this. And you can see I'm holding them up a little bit still. I'm not putting them straight down and pressing down into the semi-hydro, because the roots are fragile and I don't want to push it really. It can get a little bit tricky with trying to hold all the things exactly where you want them, but that just comes with time and practice. But from there, I'm just going to go in and fill the semi-hydro around the roots. And ideally you want to get it underneath the roots in there, all around them. You don't want to have huge pockets of air. Small pockets absolutely would be fine, but big pockets of air, not ideal, because then the roots aren't going to be having contact with the substrate, which is what they need in order to get water. And when I am going in with my fingers, I'm going in very gently. I'm not pushing down hard on it and forcing things down in there, because then that could cause root issues. And also something I do, because I don't know if you can see in there, there's a bit of an air pocket. You want to avoid that where you can. And so to do that, I either shake my vessel or I pat it down. It's harder with rings on. I should take these off. I sort of pat it and shake it. And that usually gets the substrate down into those sort of holes. So there's not a hole in there anymore. No like big gap like there was before. It's easier in a sort of self-watering pot because they're slightly more flexible than glass is. They're usually made of plastic. And so you can kind of squeeze it a little bit as well in order to get the substrate in. But in glass, it is much more solid and so harder to get around, if that makes sense. It's also important to note that your plants can go into shock when you are transferring them from something like soil to semi-hydro, from transferring from anything. They can even go into shock when you're repotting from soil to soil if you are not gentle enough. I think the best advice is just to be careful and be patient with it. Roots are fragile, but your plants are also, at the same time, your plants are probably sturdier than you think they are, and they can very much so bounce back. I've had, like I said, loads and loads of shock, especially from begonias. They really don't like the transition, and the main thing is just to be patient with them, and they'll take their time, and they might lose some leaves in the process and be a little bit unhappy for a while, but as long as you're being patient and taking your time with them and not just forcing things, you should be okay and they will be fine. So this might not have been the absolute best vessel for this plant. Maybe if I take this one out and pot it separately. Yeah, I already like that better. It's a bit less weird. Yeah. I'm just gonna put the two, and I'll pot the other one up into that self-watering pot in a little bit. But I think one of the scariest things about putting something into semi-hydro is the risk of the plant going into shock and not liking it and the roots rotting. It can happen, it absolutely can. It has happened to me. So I don't want to say that it doesn't happen, but the best advice is just to be gentle and patient and flexible, and ideally, like I said earlier, don't try semi-hydro for the first time on your favorite plant in the world. Try it on something that you don't mind being thrown around a little bit. You don't mind if it would go into shock or something. So with this ficus here, this is my Ficus Shiverina Moonshine, and I was a bit worried about putting ficus into semi-hydro. And so the first time I did it, I put my Ficus elastica taniki in semi-hydro, and I found that it worked really, really well for it. And so since I've done that one, I now feel confident in putting my slightly more uncommon Ficus Shiverina into the substrate and believing that it'll be fine. If that makes sense. So kind of go in steps. Don't try your craziest thing first, if you can help it. So here's my beautiful pot. I love that so much. And I'm going to show you where I'm going to water to. When I water, I will water to there. The first time you're seeing roots is around there. So I'm going to water to there, a quarter, a third of the way up. Really not far, just to make sure that those soil roots, especially because it is a new thing, aren't submerged in the water and staying wet, because that can cause issues and can cause the plant to rot and really have a bad time. Another big question that I regularly get is how I fertilize my plants in semi-hydro, and I tend to fertilize mine with every water because semi-hydro itself, it's inorganic. It doesn't naturally inherently have sort of any sort of nutrients to it. And so all of the nutrients that the plant is going to need, you're going to have to add in yourself. And so I tend to water every water with fertilizer. That being said, I use a houseplant specific fertilizer. I always do, because those aren't too harsh on your plant or their roots. I wouldn't necessarily suggest using something like Miracle Grow, all-purpose fertilizer on semi-hydro plants. Try and use ones that literally say on the bottle, fine for semi-hydroponics, give you a specific amount of fertilizer needed for that, because you know that those are suitable for this sort of planting. The substrate also does do quite a good job of holding on to the nutrients. Things like zeolite and other bits inside of the mix will hold on to the nutrients in the soil and slowly let it release out into your plant's roots, so your plants can kind of just like take it as they need it. You can also use something like slow release fertilizer. Places like Soil Ninja sell it because their semi-hydro doesn't have fertilizer in it. Substrates like Lechuzapon will already have slow release fertilizer in it, so you probably won't need to fertilize those plants for the first 6 months while that slow release fertilizer is still active. After the 6-month time, you should probably give your plants some sort of nutrients because they can definitely benefit from it. But because I am pretty much exclusively using the Soil Ninja stuff that doesn't have slow release in it, I will water every time I water, pretty much, or every other. If I can be bothered to water it every single time with fertilizer, I would. But sometimes when I'm watering, I'm just picking up my watering can really quickly. I'm not pulling out my fertilizer bottle every single time, even though I could. I absolutely could. I'm just lazy half the time. It's like, oh, well, I might see that the water reservoir is nearly out and I need to water it. I'll just do it quickly as opposed to taking the time to pull out the fertilizer. Another thing that you're technically supposed to do with semi-hydro is to flush it regularly. There can be a bit of mineral buildup in the substrate, especially if you have like hard water in your area, unless you're using like distilled water to water your plants, which I wouldn't. It's too much faff, don't do it. But there is some sort of water buildup. Also the substrate, when it rubs against itself, it will sort of slightly erode and you'll get sort of dust. You can see down in the bottom of the pot there, that water's not clean, even though it is like the water's just full of that sort of dust. That's completely normal, and technically you're supposed to flush the substrate probably once a month. That would be the best thing for it. I personally don't do that, partly out of laziness, but partly because I don't feel like I've had an issue not doing it. Maybe it's something that I can try going forward, and if I notice a difference, I'll let you know, but I really haven't noticed any sort of downside to not flushing. Also, with things in no drainage, it can be quite difficult to flush them. If I were to flush things in no drainage, I would fill it up high with water and then put my hand over this and then tip it out. I have done that occasionally when I've overfilled the sort of water reservoir, just tip it out. It's not the easiest and you might need to add some more substrate in on top, but it can be done. But like I said, I don't do it, and I don't think my plants mind. I haven't had any sort of major issues with them from like not flushing. Another common question I get is, how do you know when to repot your plants in semi-hydro? And it is just a bit of a learning curve, I think. You might have seen at the beginning with my Jacqueline, the roots were starting to come out of the little slats in the pot. That is kind of a good indicator. It's not always an indicator, but when the roots are growing out of it, that usually means that they're looking for something else or probably want more space. Also, if you are using something with a clear insert like this, you'll be able to see the amount of roots in there, and it'll be easier to tell when you need to repot. But my sort of go-to indicator for when plants in semi-hydro need a repot is when they are drying out faster, when you're having to water them more frequently in order for them to stay happy. That is like, I feel like a good indicator on any plant needing a repot. Soil or semi-hydro doesn't really matter. If they're drying out faster, it probably means they need some sort of size up in some way. And also for things in no drainage, if the vessel is clear, you'll probably be able to see that the roots are starting to circle around the bottom of the pot, and that is an indicator that it probably needs a repot. Like my alocasia stingray is probably overdue for one at this point. I should probably get it a bigger vessel, but I need to find myself a bigger no drainage thing for it if I want to repot it. So I'm going to those charity shops trying to find as many no drainage vessels as I can, but I prefer to buy them secondhand. I know I could just like go to a floristry shop or like find one on Amazon, like a big vase or something, but I much prefer to get my no drainage things from the charity shop if I can. A couple of troubleshooting bits. First off, pests. Your plants in semi-hydro can still get pests. It's not going to stop them from getting things like thrips, spider mites, mealies, scale, all of those sort of things that sort of feed on the sap of your leaves and stems of your plant. Those can still totally happen in semi-hydro. They can still grow, reproduce, lay eggs, etc. on the leaves, and using semi-hydro won't prevent them. It can reduce the possibility of them ever so slightly, but I've had plenty of plants in semi-hydro that have still gotten pests. The one thing that they do not necessarily fully eliminate, but drastically get rid of is fungus gnats, because fungus gnats, they lay their eggs in the soil and the larvae sort of eat the fungus that grows in the soil. And because there isn't soil, there's no organic substrate in here, there isn't the fungus that they feed on to grow. And so if you, in theory, put everything in your whole collection into semi-hydro, it would probably, I'm not going to say 100% because I don't know for sure because I've not done it, but it would probably reduce your risk of fungus gnats to maybe like 0 to 5%. Very, very, very low chances of getting fungus gnats in those situations. They mostly live in soil and breed in the soil, and so having the semi-hydro sort of negates that as a possibility. One thing you might see in semi-hydro that might look like a pest but isn't are these little white bugs that are actually springtails. They'll feed on any rotting matter in the soil, and they're actually beneficials. You can tell they're springtails because they move quite quickly compared to other pests. But like I said, it's not a pest-proof substrate. You can't get rid of all of your pests just by switching things over to semi-hydro. I have also experienced mold in semi-hydro before, and it isn't very common. Occasionally I might find a plant with a little layer of like fuzzy whitish mold on the top. It isn't really an issue. It happens in plants in soil as well. It's usually just because it's staying quite wet. When I do experience a plant that gets mold in semi-hydro, I will tend to give it a like full repot, freshen, take all of the semi-hydro off, give it a little bit of a rinse, give it fully fresh semi-hydro. By fresh, I mean like recycled pre-boiled is totally fine. It doesn't need to be straight out of the bag, but give it some new stuff, and then I'll go through and boil the old stuff to make sure anything in there is just getting out. But it won't really harm your plants. It's just a little bit unsightly, and I tend to try and remove it if I experienced it. You can also try things like watering with a little bit of hydrogen peroxide, but I mean, I actually don't think it would be that bad because that also reduces algae, which can totally occur in no drainage vessels, especially, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just give it a repot with some fresh stuff and you'll be fine. Okay, I think that is everything that I wanted to talk about in today's semi-hydro video. I really hope that you feel like you have a better idea about the substrate now and how to get started with it. I highly, highly recommend it. I really do love semi-hydro substrate, otherwise I wouldn't spend this entire length of time, which might be up to an hour. It's been an hour and a half of me filming. I don't know, I really hope this video is not an hour and a half long, but I wouldn't go through the trouble of talking so much about it if I didn't think that it was a really valuable resource, and it does genuinely make my life easier for a lot of plants, especially alocasias. I absolutely love putting my alocasias in semi-hydro. So I really hope that I was able to answer your questions in this video. If you have any more, feel free to pop them down below in the comments and I can hopefully answer those, or you can potentially shoot me a DM. I'll do my best to answer them. But otherwise, this is where this video ends. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please give it a thumbs up down below and leave a comment on other houseplanty things you'd like me to talk about in the future, and subscribe for more. And don't forget to hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified when I post new videos. Thank you again for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you're having a fantastic day and I will see you in the next one. Don't forget to keep growing. Bye!